We all think we know the story of the 300 Spartans, right? But what if I told you that legendary last stand isn't the whole story? Not even close. In this explainer, we are going to pull back the curtain on the myth and look at the real strategy, the bitter infighting, and the unbelievable gambles that led to one of history's most famous victories. You know the story. 300 Spartans, a heroic sacrifice, and Greece is saved. It's an incredible tale. But the reality? Oh, it's so much more complicated and, honestly, way more interesting. We're talking about a drama filled with brilliant strategy, but also deep-seated rivalries that almost tore the whole Greek alliance apart before they even got going. To really get a grip on what the Greeks were up against, you have to start with the sheer size of the Persian invasion. Herodotus, who's our main guide for this whole story, he tells us that King Xerxes brought an army and entourage of over 5 million people to conquer Greece. I mean, just try to picture that. Okay, so 5 million? That makes for an amazing story, but logistically, it's just impossible. Modern historians figure the real number was probably somewhere between 70,000 and 300,000. Now, don't get me wrong, that is still an absolutely massive force for the ancient world. But the exaggeration itself tells you something, doesn't it? It frames this whole thing as a near-miraculous David versus Goliath fight from the very beginning. Right, let's dive into this quote because this warning from Xerxes' own advisor really gets to the heart of the matter. The Persians' greatest strength, their insane numbers, was also their single biggest weakness. I mean, how do you feed an army that size? How do you keep a massive fleet safe from storms? The whole campaign was a logistical nightmare waiting to happen. So, you're the Greeks. You're facing this colossal invasion. You know you have to work together. The problem is, just agreeing on a plan was their first major battle, and it was a battle they nearly lost against themselves. Let's break down the plan they finally, and kind of grudgingly, settled on. About 30 of the Greek city-states band together to form the Hellenic League, with Sparta taking the lead, and they come up with this really high-stakes strategy. They have to stop the Persians on land and at sea at the exact same time. It wasn't a choice, it was an absolute necessity. The plan itself, tactically, it was brilliant. You see, the army at the pass of Thermopylae and the navy in the Strait of Artemisium, they were close enough to protect each other's flank. If one position fell, the other would be trapped. They had to hold together. But, and this is a big but, this sound military logic immediately ripped open a deep, dangerous crack in the Greek alliance. And this brings us to the one argument that basically defined the entire Greek campaign. On one side, you had states like Athens who wanted a forward defense, go north and meet the Persians head-on. On the other side, you had the Peloponnesian states like Sparta and Corinth. Their answer to everything was, let's abandon the north and fall back to a giant wall at the Isthmus of Corinth, right in their backyard. And look, this wasn't some theoretical debate happening in a war room. According to Herodotus, this argument was happening right there on the front lines at Thermopylae. The other Peloponnesian commanders wanted to pack up and run back to the isthmus. It was the Spartan king Leonidas himself who had to put his foot down and insist they stay. It's a classic theme you see in Herodotus' writing, the heroic individual holding the line against all the doubters. Of course, once a traitor showed the Persians a path around the pass, Leonidas knew the position was lost. He sent most of the army away to safety. But he and his 300 Spartans stayed. And what's so often forgotten in the legend is that they were not alone. 700 soldiers from a city called Thespiae voluntarily chose to stay and die with them, an incredible sacrifice that deserves to be remembered. Okay, so with the army at Thermopylae wiped out and Athens itself sacked and burned to the ground, the fleet falls back to the island of Salamis. And it's here that the strategic tension, that constant fight between stand and fight versus run for the isthmus, reaches an absolute fever pitch. So what did the Peloponnesian commanders want to do? You guessed it, retreat to the isthmus. Their leader, a Corinthian named Adimantus, argued that fighting at Salamis was a death trap. If they lost, the fleet would be cornered. It's a logical fear, sure, but it also meant completely abandoning the city of Athens and its people to their fate. And the debate got ugly. It got really personal. With Athens occupied, Adimantus basically mocked the Athenian general, Themistocles, calling him a homeless refugee who had no right to even have an opinion. You can just feel the raw, bitter rivalry between these supposed allies in that one quote. And this is where Themistocles shows his political genius. He responds with a cold, hard ultimatum. He says, fine, our city is gone, but our 200 ships, which by the way are the majority of this fleet, are Athens now. And if you retreat, we'll just pack up our families and sail away to Italy, leaving you to face the Persian navy all by yourselves. The bluff was a masterstroke. It worked. But even after that, they kept arguing. So Themistocles takes one of the biggest gambles in military history. He secretly sends a messenger to the Persian king, pretending to be a traitor, and tells him the Greeks are panicked and planning to escape during the night. The Persians totally bought it. They moved their fleet to block all the escape routes, and in doing so, they trapped the Greeks, forcing the exact battle Themistocles wanted right where he wanted it. Now here's where it gets really interesting, because it shows you how history gets written. Herodotus, our main source, got most of his information from Athenians, and their version of the story is that as soon as the battle started, that Corinthian commander Adimantus panicked and fled. But even Herodotus admits that the Corinthians and pretty much every other Greek state said that was a flat-out lie. It's a classic case of political spin becoming historical fact. In the narrow waters off Salamis, the smaller Greek fleet won a stunning, crushing victory. The Persian navy was shattered. So that's it, right? War over? Well, the answer is a lot more complicated than you might think. After the devastating loss, Xerxes consulted Queen Artemisia, one of his allies. And her advice was just pure political genius. She told him, you should go home to secure your throne. Claim victory since you burned Athens. Leave your general Mardonius behind with a huge army to finish the job. If he wins, the glory is yours. If he loses, well, he was just a slave anyway, and your own reputation is safe. And Xerxes did exactly that. He went home, but he left behind a massive, elite army under Mardonius. So the critical point here is that the victory at Salamis didn't actually end the war. All it did was end the campaign for the year 480 BC. The biggest threat was still camped right there on Greek soil. And this forces us to totally reevaluate the whole war and ask a really important question. Where was the freedom of Greece really won? The answer came a year later, in 479 BC. The Greeks finally put that isthmus debate to bed and assembled the largest land army they had ever put together. At the Battle of Plataea, this Spartan-led force met Mardonius's army and completely destroyed it in a brutal, decisive land battle. This was the final showdown. This was the moment the Persian invasion was truly and finally defeated. So, to recap, what have we learned? This legendary victory wasn't just about a heroic last stand. It was a complex mess, won by exploiting Persian logistics, somehow navigating the internal divisions that nearly shattered the alliance, and relying on the high-stakes gambles of a few brilliant individuals. Salamis was absolutely critical, but Plataea was final. Which leads us to our final question. Who was the real architect of this victory? Was it Themistocles with his strategic genius and his ruthless politics? Was it Leonidas' sacrifice that gave Greece the will to fight on, the forgotten Thespians? Or was it that massive Spartan-led army at Plataea? You know, maybe the greatest victory of all was simply the fact that the Greeks, for all their bitter rivalries, managed not to tear themselves apart before the job was done.